This is a self-guided archive ambulation of the cinemas of Kingsland. Many of these buildings have been demolished or destroyed, but through the records and plans held at the Kingsland Borough Archives, we can trace their history and show you how they looked. This walk takes you through 5 locations where cinemas stand, once stood, or were planned to be built. The Borough Archives hold the building control plans for the old Borough Council of Kingsland and cover from 1883 up to 1960. The plans from 1960 to 1974 were sadly lost during the flood of 1978. With the help of a small team of volunteers, we have been slowly working to index the plans. It is mainly through their efforts that we can show them to you today. While working through these plans, we have made many interesting and colourful discoveries, including the cinema plans that you will see. So far, the plans have been indexed from 1883 up to 1938, so more plans may come to light later. This is a brief look at each of the individual plans and the cinemas they show, rather than an in-depth history of each. Please start at the corner of St James Road and St James Street, looking towards the police station. This site was chosen as the location for a new cinema in the late 1930s. Prior to this, there were several properties over the site, including a livery stable run by Lister Swan, according to the 1916 Kelly's Directory. There are 4 sets of plans for 2 different cinemas, which were submitted and accepted, but in the end were never built. The first set of plans are for the Regal Cinema. They date from May 1937 and are drawn by J. Owen Bond and Son, who had offices in Norwich and London. The Regal would have had a seating capacity of 1,474, larger by several hundred seats than its closest competitors. They were split over the main floor and a balcony. There was a single screen set over a full stage with an orchestra pit and an organ, in order to offer shows as well as films. The sections and elevations come with an artistic impression of how the front of the building would look, with couples and cars on the drive. The next set of plans are for a different building, called the Ritz Cinema, which was situated on the exact same site as the Regal had been intended. They were accepted in late July 1938, after a previous submission had been rejected earlier in the same month. It was designed by Leslie Kemp, a chartered architect from London. It had a total capacity of 1,480 seats over the main floor and a small balcony. There was no orchestra pit this time around, and looks to have been solely designed as a cinema rather than a multi-purpose site. There is a later deposit of plans for the same site, again by Leslie Kemp, and still under the name Ritz Cinema. These plans have remodelled the front and internal layout slightly, but the main body of the cinema remains unchanged. Why neither the Regal nor Ritz were finally built on the site is not included in the paperwork. The site was cleared at some point between 1938 and 1946. We can tell this from the Ordnance Survey maps of 1938 and the aerial photography of the town from 1946. One local legend holds that the site had been damaged by a bomb during World War II. However, the Kingsland bomb map does not support this theory. There is neither a coloured bomb plot nor the preceding pin mark in the site. Thankfully, the plans still survive and give a glimpse at what could have been built on this site. Please head west along St James Street towards the Minster and stop outside the bingo hall a short walk away. Pause the recording here until you are ready to start. Our second stop is the Theatre Royal, which has a long history of shows before it branched into films. Construction of the original building started in 1813 and it opened in 1815, with major renovations made in 1904. It received additional alterations to enable it to act as a cinema when its fortunes as a performing theatre were beginning to slow. There are a set of plans dated from May 1915 which include a drawing for the creation of an operator's box above the gallery seating. While not explicitly marked, it could well have been for projecting films rather than spotlights, although there is no screen shown for it to project films onto. The original building was lost to a fire which broke out on the stage in the early hours of the 10th of May 1936. No one was hurt in the blaze, including the theatre cat who was seen escaping from the inferno, but the props, scenery and costumes for the upcoming variety performance that was due to perform all week were lost. The fire burnt so furiously it could be seen for miles around and left the building completely gutted. The future of the Theatre Royal had already been under discussion between the Borough Council and the leaseholder. This was compounded after the fire by the search for those who still owned shares in the theatre, leading to months of negotiation and questions over what should be done next. Eventually, it was decided to replace the building. A new lease was granted to the Union Cinema Company, who already owned the other cinemas in town by this point. The new plans for the replacement building were submitted in January 1937. It was designed by Allflat and Courtney of Kingsland in an Art Deco style. It was designed primarily as a cinema, but the plans still show the full stage and orchestra pit, allowing for the continuation of theatrical performances alongside films, albeit on a much smaller scale. The new building reopened in 1938. It continued to run as a cinema until 1962, when it was converted and became a bingo hall. Of all the cinemas covered in this archive ambulation, it is one of only 2 buildings that survive intact, the others having been destroyed, demolished, or never built. The Theatre Royal was not the only cinema in Kingsland to be lost due to fire. The St James Cinema, situated on County Court Road beside the relocated gravestones, suffered the same fate in February 1937. Located partly on the site of the old workhouse, the building had replaced another, which was also lost to fire in 1904. The plans for the new building were deposited in 1905. It went on to have a varied use as a theatre, cinema and roller skating rink, before reverting back to a theatre. Films were shown again from 1922, and more alterations were made in 1923. The plans on show are by A. H. Jones, a London architect, and date from November 1933, when the building was being upgraded again. The expansion created a new and improved entrance hall, which also featured two small dance halls on the first and second floor. Inside, the cinema had a seating capacity of 1,173, split over the ground floor and a tiered first floor balcony. Unlike the Theatre Royal, the St James Cinema would not be replaced. Now head north into town along Tower Street and stop outside the Majestic Cinema, which will be on your left before you reach the shops of the Vancouver Quarter. Pause the recording here until you are ready to start. The plans for the Majestic Cinema date from June 1927 and were made by local architects John Laurie Carnell and William Dymoke White, who had offices in Kingsland, Norwich and Wisbech. These plans come with a wonderful watercolour of the front elevation, which hasn't changed much to this day. The plan sections show the elaborate detail of the ornate neo-vintage fixings of the interior, which can also be seen in photos of the foyer. Described as a cinema and ballroom on the plans, the design has a large seating area spread over the ground floor and a first floor gallery which includes 6 boxes. Sadly, unlike most of the other plans we are looking at, they do not give a definitive figure for the total number of seats. A single large ballroom was located on the top floor. This has now been converted into an additional screen. Like the St James Cinema, it shows how these venues catered for a variety of social entertainments. Alongside the original designs are some later plans, dating from 1955. This is an unusual occurrence, but not unheard of. These later designs are for a replacement screen by C. J. Foster of London. This is the only cinema on the tour that has retained its original purpose and is still showing films. It is now a Grade 2 listed building, but was almost demolished in the year 2000. Continue to the next site in the Vancouver Quarter and stand halfway up the street or near the sculpture of the globe. Pause the recording here until you are ready to start. The earliest surviving cinema plans held in the Borough archives date from May 1911. They are for the Electric Cinema, which was situated on the north-eastern side of Broad Street, approximately where the flyover bridge is, just next to the old cattle market. It was designed by Francis Burdett Ward of Wisbech for Frederick Holmes Cooper, a land agent from Cambridgeshire. It had a capacity of 530 seats over a main floor and an overhanging balcony. It was a silent film cinema and must have required a musician to accompany the films, although there is no specific location for such an individual or orchestra highlighted on the plan. There is an additional plan in the packet dating from 1912 for a set of emergency stairs. The next plan was also commissioned by Frederick Cooper and designed by Francis Burdett Ward, this time dating from March 1913. It would be known as the Empire Cinema. It was also located on Broad Street, but this time would be found on the western side on the southern end of the street. This is approximately opposite to the sculpture of the globe. It differs from the plans for the Electric Cinema, as it's described as a remodelling rather than a proposed new theatre, suggesting much of the infrastructure was already in place. This sheds some light on the previous use of the building. It had been built as an independent Presbyterian church in 1875 and later used as a public meeting space known as the Albion Hall. By 1912 it had been taken over by D.J. Botteno and was listed as the Picture Palace in that year's edition of the Kelly's Directory. But this was a short-lived venture. Frederick Cooper acquired the building shortly afterwards and began updating it. Both of these Broad Street cinemas would lose out to newer cinemas with more modern facilities, including those that showed films with sound. The Empire Cinema would cease showing films in the early 1920s. It went on to have various different uses, including as a Territorial Army drill hall and later as a crisp factory. The Electric Cinema would continue until the mid-1930s, when it also closed. However, it was briefly reopened in 1936 after the Theatre Royal burnt down, as both sites were operated by the Union Cinemas Limited Company. It would close for good in 1938 when the rebuilt Theatre Royal opened. It served as an army barracks during World War II and later as the site for L.E. Taylor's Motor Engineers. Both buildings were eventually left unused, fell into a state of disrepair and were demolished during the development of the Vancouver Quarter in the late 1960s. Continue north through the shops, up Chapel Street and St Anne's Street, past St Nicholas Chapel, until you are standing outside Trews Yard Fisherfolk Museum. Pause the recording here until you are ready to start. The final set of plans are for the Pilot Street Cinema, which were drawn and accepted in July 1938. It was designed by Keble Allflat, a local architect, in an Art Deco style for Ben and John Cully. It would be Ben Cully who built the cinema in such a short space of time, with it opening for business in November 1938. He had already built the Capitol Cinema in Hunstanton in 1932. John would go on to act as manager and run the cinema in its early years. As the name suggests, it was situated on Pilot Street, before the building of John Kennedy Way, and situated opposite the entrance to North Street. It had a capacity of 822, including some in double seats, spread over the main floor and a raised balcony at the back. There was also a full stage, which allowed for shows to be performed as well as films. It remained a cinema until 1983 and had a variety of uses afterwards. These included as a DIY hardware store and a nightclub, before it stood empty for many years. The building was demolished in 2014 and is now the site of a housing development. Thank you for listening to this archive ambulation on the cinemas of Kingsland. The Kingsland Borough Archives can be found within the Kingsland Town Hall through the Stories of Lynn Museum. See the Norfolk Record Office website for information regarding access.